My family abandoned me because my sister blamed me for her divorce. Years later, I received an email out of nowhere explaining everything with proof. So, I ruined her life with it. Almost 7 years ago, my family cut me out of their lives and kicked me out of the house. I, 29M, was 22 at the time and wasn't financially stable enough to rent an apartment on my own. What had happened was so sudden that I had no time to prepare myself for it mentally or financially. The reason behind all of this was my sister, Hannah, 37F. My sister and I have never been close because of the significant age gap between us. She got married to her boyfriend, Pete, 39M, of 3 years when she was 27. They were married for 3 years. They got divorced 3 years into their marriage because Hannah had accused Pete of having an affair with one of my friends. I had been living with my parents after college since I just started working and wanted to save some money before I moved out. My parents were okay with that arrangement as well. But that was only until my sister announced her divorce. She just came back home one day crying hysterically and announced that she'd filed for divorce because her husband had been cheating on her for 6 months. Then she went on to throw me under the bus for introducing my friend to him. My friend, Emily, 28F, was trying to gain weight, and since Pete was a certified dietitian, he agreed to help her out. I had been the one to introduce her to him, and apparently, she was the one Pete had been cheating on my sister with. I was shocked that this was happening because even though Emily and I weren't close, I knew for a fact that she was a good woman and would never get with a married man. Besides, cheating was so out of character for Pete as well. He was totally smitten with Hannah and only ever had good things to say about her. So, I found it incredibly hard to believe that he cheated on her. I had my doubts, but my parents believed her instantly and didn't even question anything, in spite of the fact that she never had any proof of him cheating. They just took her word for it. But I'm not going to hold that against them since they would choose their own daughter over their son-in-law. Regardless of who was right, what I didn't understand was why they readily kicked me out just because Hannah said so. She just stormed in one day, threw a tantrum, and somehow convinced my parents to throw me out simply because I'd been the one to introduce Emily to Pete. She accused me of ruining her marriage, and my parents agreed with her for some reason. I was devastated and tried to stop my parents, but they weren't ready to listen to me at all and told me that if I didn't leave, they'd forcefully kick me out. In just one day, I'd lost my family and my home and had absolutely no idea where to go. I was literally sobbing out on the sidewalk with all my stuff for an hour or so before I was able to pull myself together and went to a friend's house for the night. I tried contacting them every single day for the next few days, but didn't have any luck. My friend was kind enough to let me live at his place until I was able to find an apartment for myself. Unfortunately, my parents had pretty much made up their minds that I was in the wrong here and I was the one responsible for the divorce. My mom and dad had actually told me that they were disgusted by what I'd done before kicking me out, which didn't even make sense because it wasn't as if I'd been the one who Pete cheated with. They blocked my number so I couldn't get through to them at all, and when I tried to visit them, my mom threatened to call the cops on me if I didn't leave. So after that, I finally realized that they were serious about this, and actually did blame me for whatever had happened. I don't think I had any reason to be surprised since my sister always had been the favorite child. My parents had never really planned for a second child, so I ended up always getting sidelined. And while I didn't care much for it growing up, I didn't know that it would lead to something so huge. Thinking about it now, I guess I should have seen it coming. But honestly, I don't think anyone in my place could have seen something like this coming. Anyway, I even tried to figure out things for myself to make sense of it all for the next couple of weeks since Hannah and my parents had practically cut me off altogether, and I had no way to get to them. I couldn't speak to Pete either because he blocked me too, which didn't make any sense to me. I couldn't find him either because both Hannah and Pete had vacated the house they used to live in and had left to live with their respective parents instead. So I had no way to get through to anyone involved, which is why I approached my last resort to get to the truth. Emily, like I said, Emily and I weren't really close, but I had to do what I had to do. So I just asked to meet her one day and explain the situation to her. I asked her if what Hannah had said about the affair was true, and she denied it vehemently. And I believed her, to be honest. Emily told me that she'd only ever met Pete a few times and only in a professional capacity. So there was absolutely nothing going on between them. and she had no idea why Hannah would say something so awful about her. She even told me that she'd had a steady boyfriend for a couple of years already and was planning to get hitched in a few months too. She even showed me pictures, and what she told me was way more convincing than whatever Hannah had said. I had no proof, but I just knew somehow that Hannah had been lying about the real reason for the divorce. But since I had no proof, I couldn't go back to my family, and I most certainly couldn't go back without it. Back then, I was pretty desperate to go back to living with my family since I really missed them, despite what they'd done to me. With time, however, I was able to get over it and move on with my life. I managed to find a place and made my job the purpose of my life so that I'd have something to distract myself with. And I also had to pay the bills, so it was a better way of coping than just sitting around and being depressed since I didn't have any other option either. I was hurting a lot, but I knew I had to go on somehow with or without my family's support. Years passed, and now I'm doing much better in life. I've moved from my tiny apartment to a much bigger one, and even got engaged to my girlfriend of 2 years around a week ago. And our engagement post is what ended up being a game changer for me. Because just a few days after that post, I received an email out of literally nowhere that not only explained the entire story of Hannah's divorce to me and gave me all the answers I needed, but also had proof attached. My fiancée, Lisa, 30F, usually only posted us on Instagram, but the picture from our engagement made it to her Facebook feed as well, where she had a wider audience. It was a public post as well, and a lot of people saw it, including my ex-brother-in-law, Pete. He happened to be someone my fiancée had met at a seminar a few years back since she was a doctor, and it ended up adding him on Facebook, which is how he found me. It really is a small world, and for the first time, I was glad about it. He reached out to me a few days after we posted, but instead of texting me on social media, he decided to send me an anonymous email. He explained later on that he did this just so that he wouldn't feel weird about what he was doing since it had been several years since his divorce, and he didn't want to seem like a sore loser who still hadn't managed to move on from what happened. Besides, he'd been the one to block me in the first place, so he felt weird and conscious about getting back in touch with me about something that happened so many years back. Coming to the contents of the email I received, it had the full story and proof of what had happened 7 years ago, and I couldn't believe my eyes when I went through it. So apparently, my sister had been the one cheating on Pete, and not the other way around like she'd been telling us for so long. Not only was that a huge lie, but even more interesting was the fact that she'd been cheating on Pete with a friend of mine, just like she'd accused him. My friend, Frank, 28M, was a cashier at the grocery store near Hannah's house back then, and I never would have made the connection myself since I'd literally never seen them together. I guess they'd kept it well under wraps, but not enough for Pete to not find out. And when Hannah was confronted, she told Pete that it was all my fault because I'd been the one to introduce her to Frank and had even told her about how he needed her help since he was an aspiring singer, and she was a pretty good singer herself. She'd agreed to help him, and bam, they'd fallen in love before they knew it. She even said that I was in on it and had helped them keep things under wraps for so long. Obviously, all of this was a complete lie, and I hadn't even known that Frank and Hannah had something going on. He was outraged when he found out and ended up blocking my entire family, which he admits now was kind of stupid on his part. But he was so angry that he hadn't given his actions much thought. Of course, he told me all of that in person since the email itself was meant to be as impersonal as possible, as he didn't want it to be traced back to him. But I did figure it out. The proof that he attached were a bunch of screenshots of emails between my sister and Frank where they were discussing how easy it is to fool Pete and were full of confessions of love and plans for where they were going to meet next. There was no way she could deny any of this because she'd even signed off in the emails with her middle name, which not many people are aware of. I had her dead to rights. I figured out that it must have been Pete who'd sent me this email after I combed through Lisa's Facebook friends because my gut told me that this definitely had something to do with social media. And when I was finally able to find Pete in her list, I got in touch with him. We decided to meet a few days ago, and he told me that he'd found out about what Hannah had told her family from Emily, who'd met him a couple of years back. I told her to keep my side of the story a secret, and I was kicking myself for it when I realized that if I hadn't said that, she probably would have told Pete about it, and I would have been able to prove my innocence ages ago. Anyway, they'd run into each other a couple of years ago, and she'd ended up asking him about the divorce. So they got to talking, and finally, he'd also learned what Hannah had told us. He confessed that he wanted to talk to me about it and tell me the truth, but didn't because he felt weird. I swear if Pete wasn't so easily embarrassed, my life would have been a lot easier to deal with. I did forgive him, though, since I needed his help to absolutely destroy my sister, and I knew he'd be on board with it as well. Hannah had definitely been lying to my parents so she'd have financial support during her divorce, and had even thrown me under the bus for good measure because she'd known that one conversation with Emily and I'd know the truth. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that someone, especially someone who was related to me by blood, could be so selfish. I'm sure she'd never bothered to set the record straight either, and my parents had just lapped up whatever lies she'd been feeding them during her divorce. She'd known that if the truth about her being the cheater had been revealed to our parents, she would have been in big trouble, and she just couldn't risk that. Well, too bad, but it was finally out now, and I was going to use it to ruin her life just like she'd ruined mine all those years ago. I didn't know if my family lived in the same house since I hadn't visited them for 7 years, but as luck would have it, they hadn't moved. I confirmed with an old neighbor of mine before showing up and was glad to learn that Hannah was still living with them as well. That wasn't very surprising to me because Hannah always had been a couch potato and hated doing any work herself. So if she had the option of living with her aging parents and making them do all the chores for her, she'd definitely do it. Anyway, 2 days back, Pete and I just showed up without warning at their house. My mom opened the door, and we barely even gave her any time to register what was happening before we walked in. My dad and Hannah were also present in the living room, and we were one happy family again, but not for long since their expressions soured just as soon as we entered. My dad began to threaten us immediately and said that he'd call the cops if we didn't get the hell out of his house. And I shot right back, saying that he was free to do whatever he wanted to, but only after he'd read the documents that we were about to show them. My parents looked incredibly confused, but Hannah looked like she was going to barf and excused herself so that she could go to her room. I thought she was trying to escape, but there was no point in doing so anyway. Pete went on to show the divorce documents and the screenshots of Hannah and Frank's emails while I explained the real story. Pete also told my parents how Hannah had to give up our family heirloom, my grandmother's diamond ring, in a settlement because she couldn't afford to pay him the money since she's a high school teacher, so she had to sell the ring instead. My parents were already horrified by what we told them, and that was just the cherry on top. We watched the drama unfold as my dad demanded an explanation from Hannah for all that had happened, and when she still tried to lie and cover up the truth despite all the evidence against her, my dad promptly kicked her out. He packed her stuff for her and handed over the bags to her, then told us all to get the hell out of their house. I didn't need to be told twice and left with Pete while my sister begged and pleaded with my parents to let her back in, just like I had all those years ago. This was karma at its best, and I couldn't be happier about it. It's been a couple of days since then, and my sister showed up at my place a few hours ago, demanding that I make things right with my parents immediately. I didn't even know how she found me, but I told her that I didn't owe her anything anymore. She'd ruined my life once, so I repaid her the favor, and we were now fair and square. I guess she really had no pride left because as soon as I said that, she started sobbing and accusing me of being a monster. I didn't care much for her drama, though, and shut the door while she continued to sob relentlessly. I just put my headphones on and listened to music while Lisa, my fiancée, worked in her study so neither of us would be disturbed. After a while, Hannah finally left us alone, but she left a message with a marker on my door to remind me that I was nothing but a revengeful monster. I don't see anything wrong with what I did, very frankly, and don't feel sorry in the least. But Hannah seems pretty convinced that I'm the villain here somehow. I just did to her what she'd done to me several years ago, except that I told the truth while she did nothing except lie and throw me under the bus. So what do you guys think? Am I wrong for ruining my sister's life and getting her kicked out 7 years after she accused me of causing her divorce? Update 1. So Hannah has still been bothering me even though a whole week has passed since she got kicked out. I had to threaten her with the fear of cops when she called me for the 14th time today, and only then did she stop. I don't even know how she managed to find my phone number and address, but I'm least interested in that right now. Hannah's trying to make me feel sympathetic towards her because I guess a school teacher's salary isn't enough for her to live on. But I don't think that's true, and she's just upset that she has to look for a place and pay for her own rent, electricity, and groceries now that our parents have kicked her out. So I don't feel too sorry for her. And in case you guys were wondering, yes, I did block her number several times, but I guess she's making her friends add me to a conference call, so there's no point. As for my parents, they're just as bad, if not worse than Hannah. They found me on Facebook and saw the post about my engagement as well. So now they want to be part of my life once more, and even express their desire to attend my wedding. They haven't apologized yet, but for some reason, they expect me to just invite them to my wedding, which is supposed to be a really important day for me. I don't understand where these people find the guts to say crap like this, but at least I'm not responding to any of it. Lisa and I have had a field day reading their texts because there's really just no way they're for real. Right now, it's all just really sad for them. Update 2. Hannah showed up at my house yet again after I threatened to report her for harassment yesterday. I was about to leave for work, but she stopped me by throwing herself across the hood of my car and refused to budge until I spoke to her. It was pretty exasperating, and I ended up actually calling the police this time. They took her away while she screamed and cried and tried her best to show me as the bad guy here. But unfortunately, nobody was buying her sad girl act here. It took some time to press charges against her, but as soon as I got it done, I left for work because I didn't want to let this little incident ruin my day. I was sure my parents would bail her out anyway since she was their favorite, and I turned out to be right as well. My parents, after bailing her out, sent me a lengthy text about how I was being way too harsh on them for an honest mistake that they'd made almost a decade ago. It was hilarious because nothing about what my sister and parents had put me through was either honest or even a mistake. They knew what they were doing and were definitely aware of how cruel they were. But that didn't stop them from throwing me out onto the street in spite of knowing that I had no other place to go. So now that I can do for dinner, and so we could sort out our differences in a civilized manner before the wedding. Bold of them to assume that I'd even want them at my wedding in the first place. We had a good laugh about their stupid message, and after that, I wrote right back saying that I wasn't interested in the slightest in anything that they'd invited us to, and was just fine living away from them like I had for these past years. They'd shown me that I was better off without them, and I was forever going to be thankful for that. I didn't need them at all anymore, and neither did I want their so-called forgiveness so they could peacefully continue to play happy family with my sister like they had been so far. With that last text, I blocked them once and for all because I didn't even want the laughs anymore. I was done, and I was out. I'm sure they'll try to get back in touch with me one way or another soon, but too bad for them, I'm not having it anymore. Lisa is the only family I need now, and I'm happy with just her. My parents and my sister have unfortunately never been able to look beyond themselves, and I highly doubt that they ever will. So the next time they get in touch with me, they'll be speaking to my lawyer as well, and that's a promise.